Benjamins stack up.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain.
As the American military brass planned the invasion of Afghanistan, President Bush looked to Prime Minister Blair for his input.
I appreciate his advice, I appreciate his counsel, and I appreciate his friendship.
One of the first things that was done was dropping of food, paratrooping in food to Afghans. And that was Tony Blair's idea. That came about on a secure phone call between George Bush and Tony Blair, where Blair said, at the same time that we're going in with the military, let's go in with food aid to also send a signal to the Afghanistani people that we, the West, are on your side. And President Bush loved that idea, and that's exactly what they did.
Bush and Blair agreed that fighting the war on terror would require a new strategy. Tyrannical regimes could no longer be contained, and it would now fall to free nations to preempt these regimes before they posed an imminent threat.
I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
The central idea that we could act on our own, we could have a forward policy on freedom and democracy and fighting terror in its own backyard, these were the things that Blair had worked out for himself, and in many ways had articulated earlier. He was way out of line with almost everybody he knew, all his friends, all his colleagues, his governmental colleagues, his cabinet colleagues. He was absolutely out on a limb. It was a very, very extraordinary thing to see.
Is this threat something that you can manage, treat with, sort of compromise with, and evolve out of it, right? Which is one view, not a stupid view, but it's one view. Or is it something that is fundamental and has to be confronted and defeated? Now, I took the latter view.
Tony Blair could see beyond the horizon. He had a good strategic vision, and he understood that there is an ideological struggle taking place, and that on the one hand you got to have tough, hard power, and as he put it, he used to soft power as well. I agreed completely.
As the two leaders surveyed the global landscape, they focused on Saddam Hussein as the leading threat. The Iraqi dictator was a relentless sponsor of terrorism. For over a decade, Saddam had defied the United Nations.
This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
As the attention turned from 9/11 increasingly to the issue of how to deal with Saddam Hussein, it was clear that both leaders viewed him as a threat to peace because of his clear intention and past history of pursuing nuclear weapons as support for terror, his invasion of his neighbors, and his oppression of his own people.
But as plans for an invasion progressed, Bush and Blair found themselves in disagreement on a key issue.
The biggest disagreement was whether or not we needed to have a second resolution at the United Nations to authorize the use of force. And Prime Minister Blair made it clear to President Bush that it was important to him. He thought it was diplomatically the right thing to do, and it's the best way to have as large a coalition as possible with us.
Tony Blair visited George W. Bush at Camp David to persuade him to seek an additional resolution from the United Nations before launching a military campaign against Saddam Hussein.
Tony had come and wanted to talk about what I call in the book coercive diplomacy, which is a strong diplomatic track paralleled with a strong military track, so that the diplomacy would be effective. But if it didn't work, there'd be a military option. And part of that was him talking to me about going to the United Nations to seek a Security Council resolution.
They had a long discussion on Iraq, on what should be done about Iraq, and particularly about the need to build an international coalition. Tony Blair felt very strongly that, as on Afghanistan, after 9/11, you needed to bring people with you. You needed to gather the whole world community to try and deal with this. And that's why he argued very strongly at that time for involving the UN.
President Bush understood from Prime Minister Blair very early on that in order for him to provide the type of public support for a potential military campaign in Iraq, that the UN was going to have to play a significant role. Those discussions took place in the preceding summer before the invasion. And that's when President Bush made the decision in September of 2002 to go to the United Nations and lay out the case against Saddam Hussein. That decision to do that was in large part in response to his consultations with Prime Minister Blair.
The interesting thing here, for the criticisms in the United Kingdom about Tony Blair following whatever George Bush said, the fact of the matter is George Bush often followed what Tony Blair said, out of respect for Tony Blair and out of a desire to help Tony Blair.
I came down the side of going to the UN because I wanted to have others with us. And by the way, John Howard said, get a resolution. And John Howard of Australia, one of our strongest allies. So I listened to the other leaders a lot.
I could also see, because I was on the other side of the water, in UK and European politics, unless we involved the UN, we were likely to be on our own. But I felt, you know, to get us, in the end with Iraq, with some 30 countries in the coalition, that was important in order to say to people, this isn't just America or America and its close ally, the UK. This is something on behalf of our way of life and our, not just our two countries.
I remember after one of their meetings, basically his message was, we're going to try to do this diplomatically, but if at the end of the day, if I have to use military force, I will. Will you be with me? And when the president came out and he said with obvious relief, Blair and I are going to try to do this diplomatically, but we agreed that if we have to use force, he'll stand with America.
Coming up, the costs of war.
We will be with you in this fight for liberty.
The British public erupts in protest, and Tony Blair almost loses his government. Plus, as the war effort falters, Bush and Blair push a new strategy against bitter opposition.